Happening overnight, likely when you were sleeping, Russia launched an assault on Ukraine. Explosions seen and heard in cities like the capital city, Kiev. I'm News 8 digital anchor Luke Laster here from the Wood TV Live Desk. Joining me this morning, David Jesuit. He's the chair of the Central Michigan University's Political Science Department and Model UN advisor. Dr. Jesuit, good morning. Things evolving here by the moment. Thanks for taking some time to join us.
Good morning. Thank you for inviting me.
You bet, you bet. So first off, before we dive in here, could you explain your role at Central there and a little bit on your background?
Sure. I'm a professor of political science and chairperson of the Department of Political Science and Public Administration. My teaching and research focuses on Europe. One of the courses I teach, for example, is Europe and the European Union, as well as Model UN, which you mentioned. I was fortunate to live and do research in Europe for 4 years in Italy and Luxembourg, in fact, actually before joining the faculty at Central Michigan University in 2003.
So in terms of the crisis going on right now, let's go back, I guess, about 24 hours before now, leading up to last night here, at least in our time zone. What got us to this point?
Okay. Well, I was hoping you would lead in, well, let's go back to the end of the Cold War instead of 24 hours. Look, because I think that really the origins of this current conflict go back to the fall of the Soviet Union. And even a year before that, the unification or reunification of Germany. When Germany reunified in 1990, the Berlin Wall fell, recall, November 1989, October 1990. Germany is reunified, and there were questions about whether or not Germany would join NATO, a unified Germany. And at the time, Western leaders, including George Herbert Walker Bush, Margaret Thatcher, Francois Mitterrand, Helmut Kohl, had persuaded Gorbachev that in fact, yes, it was wise to include Germany, and that had to do with the initial purpose of NATO, which, as the first Secretary General said, was to keep the Russians out, keep the Germans down, and keep the Americans in. So NATO expands, but there were all the evidence suggests that there were these reassurances from the West that there were no intentions to actually expand NATO further. Well, by 1999, Poland, Hungary, and Czech Republic became members. And those are former Warsaw Pact countries. That was the military alliance that the Soviet Union had created in order to counterbalance NATO. 5 years after that, they expands again and includes former Soviet republics, the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, as well as Romania, Bulgaria. It's expanded again since then. But it really was that expansion into the former Soviet republics, those Baltic states I mentioned, that started the interference in Ukrainian domestic affairs. They interfered in an election. They poisoned a candidate who was more pro-West, talked about membership in the European Union and NATO membership down the road, and installed a leader who was more oriented toward Russia, which reflects a divide that has existed for hundreds of years in Ukraine. And so this has been a long-term policy of Russia to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO. And I'm not surprised of the full-scale invasion, because going back to, my goodness, 2 months ago, they started positioning troops that were really troops that could be there for just one purpose, which would be a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. I think that the Russia watchers, as we call them now, they had expected the invasion to occur after the Olympics were over. And so, guess what? Closing ceremony, over the weekend? It was just a matter of time. And it's important, and this ties into a larger concern that many of us have. People's Republic of China and Russia have been coordinating and are strategic partners once again. And in 2008, when Putin invaded Georgia, which was seeking NATO membership, he did it in August and interfered with the Beijing Summer Olympics, and the leaders of China were quite upset that he disrupted their event. That puts China on the world stage, and so and it violates an unwritten norm that there's supposed to be a truce during Olympics, which is all about peace and understanding, and of course it's never stopped wars from continuing. But this was, an invasion, and it detracted from China's spot on the world stage, and they were upset going back to 2008. So, people were not expecting the invasion until after the Olympics, or a number of Russia experts were just thinking, oh, it's going to be after the Olympics are over, and here we are.
So I guess my question then, with how historic this really is and how far back into history it goes, why now?
Well, again, I'd put it in I'd say that this has been part of Putin's plan all along. I mean, he hasn't made any secret that he thought the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, and he's wanted to restore Russia to its greatness, its former greatness, and restore the Russian Empire. And a key part of that, perhaps the key part of that, is control of Ukraine, which is a fertile breadbasket of Europe. It's at the heart of that Eurasian continent, natural resources, a very close cultural affinity to Russia by sharing the Eastern Orthodox Christian faith. And there's been a struggle within Ukraine for an independent Ukrainian identity of people who speak the Ukrainian language, as opposed to those who are more ethnically close to Russia and speak Russian. During the period of the Soviet Union, they were under an authoritarian, totalitarian state, and that kind of expression of Ukrainian identity was not possible. So upon independence, the collapse of the Soviet Union, as I said, 91, 92, independence for Ukraine, then there began that effort to assert or reassert a Ukrainian identity. So I don't think that this is anything recent. This has been part of the plan all along, and it's been incremental. I mean, you can look at Crimea in 2014 as the first step, or go back to what I had mentioned in 2008 with the invasion of Georgia. I don't think that he's necessarily operating on a timetable that looks at what the United States is doing. I mentioned the Olympics. That was simply tactical timing. I mean, he was positioning troops. He was ready for this. Frankly, I don't think it would have mattered who the U.S. president was. We've seen this under Republican and Democratic presidents, and this has been part of his plan.
Ukraine is saying that it's Russia's intent to destroy the state of Ukraine. Is that something that we could actually see happen?
Well, I think that they will occupy. They will defeat, unfortunately, the Ukrainian military. From what I've read, and everything, is changing so quickly. There are many Ukrainians. They're overwhelmed. The military force that Russia has brought to bear is enormous, and the Ukrainian military is much better organized and more well equipped than they were just 4 years ago, for example. But they won't be able to repel the Russian invasion. And so Russia will be occupying Ukraine. I suspect then we'll see an insurgency. That insurgency, Russia's had experience with insurgency in Afghanistan. The United States has had experience with insurgency in Afghanistan and Iraq. It's costly, but I think that the goal right now for Western leaders, for the United States and NATO allies, is to contain all of the tragedy, because it is a human tragedy in Ukraine, but is to contain that to Ukraine. And if it is contained in that one country, we will see continued insurgency and violence. And I suspect at some point, and maybe this is just being an optimist, even on this terrible day, is we'll see a post-Putin Russia. And one hopes that that post-Putin Russia will consider the multilateral system of security and that zone of peace and prosperity, as I like to call it, that Europe has created for Poland, for example, and Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. I mean, that's what Ukrainian people would like, is that same opportunity that they weren't afforded. They were in the middle of the Second World War, invaded, taken over by Germany, and then, as I like to tell my students, quote unquote, liberated by Joe Stalin in the Soviet Union. It's a tragic history. And Ukraine was in the middle of that, and those divisions exist today. In fact, it's why Putin is defending his actions by telling the Russian people that it's about denazification. He wants to get rid of the Nazis in Ukraine. Well, in the Second World War, I mean, it really was that. But that historical memory persists, and he's seeking to inflame those divisions once again.
You mentioned those other countries in NATO just trying to contain tragedy. We're seeing them making statements and responding. We're seeing it on all kinds of platforms, including the U.S. But tangibly, what can be done from other countries in NATO during a time like this?
Well, we will see. The sanctions the sanctions that are being imposed are so-called smart sanctions. I mean, the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, pausing certification of that by Germany with support pressure from other allies, including the United States. I mean, that will hurt the Russian energy sector. It will hurt Europeans as well, who rely on energy from to a large extent from Russia. So those sanctions will cause some pain. The sanctions won't, I don't think, have any effect on changing Putin's behavior. So the main thing is sending a message that is very clear that the countries that are part of NATO, and in this case I'm thinking mostly about Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, that were former Soviet republics like Ukraine. And then I would add Poland and Hungary as a second tier where there are these great concerns. They want to be sure that Putin doesn't miscalculate and decide, well, things are going so well in Ukraine, why don't I just invade Estonia? That's a commitment under the NATO treaty, Article 5 of the treaty, that an attack on Estonia would be like an attack on the United States or any member country. And the United States, I'm confident, would respond with a much more overwhelming military response, targeted perhaps, but it would not be. It would be frightening if there's an invasion of a NATO country. So you want to make sure, look, don't miscalculate. The consequences will be unacceptable. We cannot afford to walk away from our treaty commitments to NATO countries. That would send a message to those other countries around the world that the United States has made commitments to. Taiwan, Japan, even Republic of Korea, that, okay, well, the U.S. says they're going to come to our defense, but but did they do that in Estonia? That can't, it won't happen. I mean, there will be a response. And so how do you send the message clearly to Putin that, don't even think about it? You send more troops and more troops. And that's what I mean. If you can contain it to Ukraine, perhaps you could avoid a wider conflict that would involve, many, many, many more casualties.
Is there a few more topics I'd like to hit on, but is there a timeline of maybe how long this could possibly last?
Well, I mean, Putin is playing a long game somewhat, so to speak,
Right.
is what I alluded to. So, this is part of the puzzle. This is a crucial part of eventually restoring Russian empire. I mean, you have to think about it. Putin might even be calculating that he won't see this restored in his lifetime. If he could just hang on to Ukraine and hopefully divide, from his perspective, Europe, and maybe it'll take several years. But he hopes that the cost to Europeans will be too high, that the support for the Baltic states will wane. Americans, do Americans want to go to fight and die to defend Estonia? He's counting on Americans eventually saying, nah, no, we're not doing it, despite the commitments that have already been made. So he's playing a longer game. I mean, don't expect this to be a quick resolution. The military campaign, the conventional military campaign, I think will be over fairly quickly. I mean, just like the military, look, think about the U.S. invasion of Iraq and how quickly the conventional military campaign was over. And the so-called mission accomplished. I mean, that first phase will be over, but that doesn't mean that that doesn't mean that there's victory or mission accomplished. So he's preparing to stay for the long term, for sure, 5, 10 years. He's thinking long term.
We're getting a lot of questions kind of rolling in here just about the United States involvement here. Can you just kind of run through their general involvement in what we're seeing there?
Well, as I understand it, the rapid response forces had already been on alert. You think about the 101st Airborne units that are ready to respond very quickly to any international crisis. There are maybe 1,500 troops in Poland, more on the way. Hundreds of troops, 800, I believe I saw, to Estonia. And there are more on the way. There are, those are commitments. It's not that those forces will be sufficient to repel a Russian invasion. If Russia is determined to invade Estonia, they can do that. It's there to indicate that if they do, there will be a military response from the United States to uphold its commitments, and so that's a clear message. I mean, the forces that are in the region are not there to push Russia out of Ukraine. There are far too few military forces in position to undertake that kind of military operation. They're there as a message. There are military equipment has been being shipped to Ukraine for years now, and that effort has picked up from other allies in Europe to send them military equipment. Ukrainians would like more military equipment. I suspect, though, that again, we'll have to see that when this first phase ends, there will be continued support for insurgents in Ukraine, and Russia, of course, is on the border, so it'll be easy for them to position materials, personnel in Ukraine. But NATO allies, in particular, I'm thinking Hungary, Poland are also on the border. So there could be, um, a military buildup in Ukraine. It's not going to be resolved soon.
What would you say is the biggest concern for the United States at this time with this conflict between Russia and Ukraine?
Well, I think there will be those. The consumers are already feeling some of the effects. American consumers around the world. There, markets like stability, and so the stock market is going to fluctuate. And some people are going to lose money, other people are going to make money. Then, we'll pay more for gasoline, and we're already seeing that. But Russia is a big supplier. But my fear is that either that there's that miscalculation, and that Putin decides he can invade NATO country without retaliation or retribution. That will lead to a much wider conflict. And Putin has been, I think, reckless in alluding to the thermonuclear weapons that Russia has. It reminds me of the Cold War. I'm old enough. I grew up in Cold War Part 2, as I like to say, in the 1980s, as I like to tell my students, I should say. And so, that there is that reality that the capabilities exist for casualties on the scale that, make even the Second World War look small. If there's some miscalculation, I don't think it'll come to that. I very much hope. But if you're going to ask me what's my greatest fear, yeah, Putin's either messianic, he's not rational. He wants to reunite this greater Russia under perhaps this Eastern Orthodox faith, and he sees himself in some, messianic, narcissistic, ways that we think of Hitler. He's not rational. That's scary. I don't think that's true, by the way, but that could be horrific. Somehow Russia's cyber attack succeeds against U.S. military cyber defenses. I don't think that's likely. I know the U.S. military, I know from people who do know, that the U.S. military is well prepared and knows that, any kind of attack on the highest levels of our command control communications, the nuclear deterrent, satellites. I mean, there are measures underway to ensure that Russia can't infiltrate or impede our ability to see and hear what's going on in the region. But if they somehow overwhelm U.S. military capabilities, technological capabilities, which I don't think will happen again. That's the other nightmare scenario to me, is then things escalate very quickly. I think our civilian, the internet, I mean, we've already seen that. Civilian cyber defenses aren't really up to the task of a full-scale cyber war, and there could be disruption of banking, finance, of the internet. And that will be, difficult for consumers, but we'd get through that. So I got one more nightmare scenario. My wife tells me, I will say, that when I get all these media requests, yesterday she said, I know something in the world, something bad is going on in the world if you're getting all these media requests. So yeah,
unfortunately.
Yeah, I lie awake at night and I think of some of these scenarios. The third one would be China taking this and invading Taiwan. Then you're looking at a war, a world war, World War III.
Well, Dr. Jesuit, we appreciate your time. Is there anything else that you would like to mention here?
Well, despite me throwing out these scenarios that are horrific to contemplate, I think that really the tragedy has to do with what's happening to the Ukrainian people, and so bear that in mind. And I don't think that this will spill into a larger conflict, but just because it doesn't spill into a larger conflict doesn't mean that it's not tragic. And so my thoughts are today are with the people that are already suffering and are certainly will suffer as a result of this Russian aggression.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you'd like to watch this conversation back, you can head over to the link that's attached to the stream. It'll take you over to woodtv.com for my full conversation here with Dr. Jesuit. Sir, we appreciate your time again. Thank you. And folks, again, head over to woodtv.com if you want to watch this back. It will be there right as I end this stream. So, sir, we appreciate it. Folks, have a great afternoon. We'll see you around. I'm News 8 digital anchor Luke Laster here from the Wood TV Live Desk. Thanks again.
Thanks, Luke.